I got some bad news for you, Luke. And it doesn't get any better. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo episodes. The gang are enjoying a Halloween costume party hosted by the wealthy aunt of one of their friends, until it is interrupted by a ghost with a history of terrorizing her family. This is the third time the Scooby-Doo franchise borrowed a villain from classic literature. The first was Mr. Hyde from the second season of Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, and the second was Something Something Joe from the second season of the new Scooby-Doo movies. Remember the wise words of Uncle Walt. Public domain means never worrying about copyright until eventually you get big enough that you can lobby the government to change copyright laws so your stuff will never enter the public domain.
He's my great-great-grandfather, Ichabod Crane.
You mean the Ichabod Crane?
Until one dark night, along the road to the cemetery, he found himself being chased by...
A Headless Horseman!
In this episode, the bad guy is the famous Headless Horseman from Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, a ghost of a Hessian soldier from the American Revolution.
His headless body was burned in a cemetery right down the road from here.
Unlike John Townsend's, I'm no expert on the colonial era, but I am fairly certain they didn't typically burn bodies at the time. Even enemy soldiers were usually buried intact by the Revolutionary Army. Desecrating a body can often be the catalyst for a haunting, but that was not part of the original Washington Irving story, and there's no mention here of that being the reason for the Headless Horseman to seek vengeance from beyond the grave. In addition to not being the first time a Scooby villain was based on a 19th century work of fiction, this is not the first time a headless spirit showed up in the Scooby-Doo-niverse. In addition to the Headless Spectre from, again, the second season of Scooby-Doo Where Are You?, a pair of Headless Horsemen appear briefly in the first season of the new Scooby-Doo movies.
It's the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow! What happened to their heads?
This reuse of a villain is so much worse this time around because the ghosts in that episode are specifically named as being from Sleepy Hollow. Although why there were two of them isn't explained. Like a lot of what transpired in the new Scooby-Doo movies.
In the middle of the battle, the revolutionaries fired a cannon at the enemy and hit one of the bravest Hessian soldiers, taking off his head. They never found it.
I wouldn't guess they'd look very hard.
Take a moment to appreciate they're describing a violent battlefield decapitation in a Saturday morning kids cartoon.
Which is why he chased my great-great-grandfather, Ichabod Crane.
What happened to Ichabod?
We don't know. Nobody in Sleepy Hollow ever saw him again.
Beth claims to be Ichabod's great-great-grandchild, and by now, my viewers should know how much I love checking the math on stuff like this. American author Washington Irving's original novella, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, was likely set in 1790 and told the story of a young schoolmaster, Ichabod Crane, who was interested in marrying the daughter of a wealthy local farmer. Though Ichabod's age is never explicitly given, considering his occupation and his unmarried status, he was probably no older than in his mid-20s, putting his birth year around 1765. Setting aside the events recounted in the original story, let's just try to ascertain if Ichabod could have even been the right age to be Beth's great-great-grandfather. If we start from the uncomfortably youngest age of having a child, but mostly acceptable at the time, age 15, this would put the earliest birth years of Ichabod's child in 1780, his grandchild in 1795, his great-grandchild in 1810, and his great-great-grandchild in 1825. On the opposite side, if going by the oldest one could be expected to be a new parent, age 50, that puts the latest birth years of Ichabod's child in 1815, his grandchild in 1865, his great-grandchild in 1915, and his great-great-grandchild in 1965. Thus, the wide range of possible birth years of Ichabod Crane's great-great-grandchild would be between 1825 and 1965. Beth's age is never stated, but being a young friend of the gang, she's likely an older teenager. This episode aired in 1976, so if Beth is between 16 and 18, her birth year would have been between 1958 to 1960, which does fall within the range previously given. While Beth could have been the great-great-grandchild of the famous Ichabod Crane, this would have only been possible if at least one parent from each generation from 1765 to 1958 was in their 50s at the time they had a child. Possible, but unlikely. Now, the reason I began this little tangent by saying we had to set aside the events recounted in the original story is that as far as we know from what's included in Irving's novella, Ichabod Crane never had any children. He was in the process of trying to court a possible wife when he was attacked by the Headless Horseman and disappeared, never to be seen again. It's tricky to have great-great-grandchildren when you never had a child to begin with. We are, of course, talking about a fictional universe being discussed within another fictional universe. It's possible Beth's Ichabod went on to start a life in another town and raised a family there. Except this Scooby episode takes place in Sleepy Hollow, and he had to have been the same Ichabod Crane from the story, otherwise Fred and the rest wouldn't have known Beth's relative was famous. All of this could have been avoided if the Scooby writers had merely described Ichabod as an ancestor of Beth, which could have made him a childless great-great-great-uncle or fourth cousin 8 times removed. I don't know how cousins work. Which would not have required him to sire any offspring himself. Speaking of cousins, the villain behind the Headless Horseman is Elwood Crane, Beth's older cousin and nephew of Gertrude Crane, the wealthy host of the masquerade party attended by the gang.
The Headless Horseman appeared as soon as you brought that diamond into this house.
Oh, dear Elwood, for a businessman who runs a big company like Apex International Shoes, you certainly are superstitious.
Everybody got that?
Elwood was the owner of a large shoe company, but when his business failed, turned to crime. In this case, he planned to steal his Aunt Gertrude's expensive diamond necklace and skip the country.
Apex International Shoe Manufacturers files for bankruptcy.
Oh, dear. Elwood's company went broke.
How could she have not known Elwood's business failed? Not only was this in the newspaper, but families usually gossip, and someone should have at least mentioned it to her once. As said, dressing up as a 19th century literary character isn't unique for the Scooby-Doo-niverse, nor is jewel theft. In fact, the first episode featuring a bad guy from fiction also involves stealing jewelry. Elwood gets 0 credit for being unique. Would his crime be profitable? That's hard to say. The only object stolen was a presumably expensive diamond necklace, and while it's obviously worth some money, that's only if the thief can find a buyer. Jewelry can be a double-edged sword for criminals, especially for the more expensive and intricate pieces. On the one hand, such objects are undoubtedly valuable and easy to hide and transport. On the other hand, the more valuable and famous a piece is, the harder it is to find a buyer. Not only would a thief be lucky to get even a third of what the stolen jewelry is worth, but the more recognizable it is, the less likely any potential buyer would want to be seen with it. It would be like stealing the Mona Lisa. Even if you were able to successfully get it out of the Louvre, where would you take it? It is such an easily identifiable piece of art that not only would you have to find a wealthy buyer, that buyer would also not have to care if they were found in possession of it. Art and jewelry are generally meant to be displayed, whether on a wall or on the neck. Someone willing to pay a lot for something they couldn't allow others to see limits the pool to a very small number of people. This is not to say that such thefts don't happen. Hell, the Mona Lisa was in fact famously stolen in the early 20th century. In that case, however, the thief thought he could earn a reward by repatriating the painting to his homeland of Italy. In similar crimes, though, it's more likely for an unscrupulous collector to commission thieves to steal a piece they had their eye on with the intention of privately displaying it in some corner of their home that would be open only to those they trusted and not the general public. It's possible that Elwood had such a buyer in mind when he stole the necklace, but it's more likely that While under the strain from his failing business, he panicked and concocted a poorly thought-out scheme.
You always were my favorite nephew, Elwood.
A scheme that feels even more unnecessary when you consider that, as her favorite nephew, couldn't Elwood have simply asked for a loan or other financial support from his aunt? If I had to guess, his pride probably wouldn't allow him to lower his head to ask for help. Elwood Crane gets a 2 out of 5 for the design. The plan was hardly original, and regardless of how valuable the necklace was, it would be difficult for him to sell it, and even if he did, it wouldn't be for anywhere near its true value and unlikely to fund much of a comfortable life on the run. I've already said that the Headless Horseman wasn't a unique choice, but it gets worse than just appearing in previous Scooby episodes. In the original Sleepy Hollow story, Ichabod Crane had been attacked with a regular pumpkin, not a jack-o'-lantern. That was an image popularized by a Disney cartoon and borrowed by pretty much every incarnation of the ghost ever since. So not only did Elwood's costume derive from previous Scooby villains, but also Walt Disney as well. Possibly the most evil villain of all time.
Here it is. The crypt where Beth said the Headless Horseman is buried. It seems pretty solid. Anybody in there is staying in there.
Beth said earlier that the Headless Horseman's body had been burned in the cemetery, but this shows it was entombed in a crypt. In most wars, dead soldiers don't get burned, even those of enemy combatants, unless there's no time or facilities to give them proper burials, or the risk of disease makes it necessary to dispose of corpses as soon as possible. Even assuming the Headless Horseman had been intentionally cremated and his ashes kept, they probably wouldn't have been put in a crypt like that. The most likely explanation for all of this is the original line in the script should have been buried instead of burned, and there was either a typo or the actor read the line wrong in the booth and nobody caught it at the time. Let's talk special effects. There were no special effects.
He practically ran over us, and the horse was all glowing, and the rider's head was like that pumpkin.
The Headless Horseman's horse was white, but clearly not glowing. This is further proved because, unlike most other Scooby episodes that feature a glowing antagonist, the gang never find any buckets of phosphorescent paint or anything else to explain the effect.
Wow! Do you suppose the Horseman's come back to get a new head?
This is a masquerade party, remember? They probably saw one of the costume guests.
Speaking of costumes, kudos to the animators who incorporated Fred's ascot into his pirate outfit. I appreciated this clever touch. I know I just said there were no special effects, but this happened.
Zoinks! It's him!
I want a head!
As I said in my video about one of the other earlier Headless villains, it takes a lot of skill to be able to tuck your head inside your shirt to convincingly portray the effect. But it's less believable this time around. I mean, look at Elwood. Far be it from me to point out the obvious, but he's middle-aged and somewhat pudgy. Not only does his body type not match the more athletic physique of the ghost throughout the episode, but we're also expected to believe there was room for Elwood to pull his head into his suit? Perhaps the only praise that can be given to the Headless Horseman is how appropriate it was as the choice for Elwood's disguise. When your family history is overshadowed by a famous ghost, it's a no-brainer to base your supernatural shenanigans around it.
I want a head!
Let's get out of here!
Run for it!
Wait for me, Henry!
Hurry, hurry!
This was a costume party, so didn't the guests seem to panic just a little too easily? How did they immediately know the Headless Horseman wasn't just another guest showing off his disguise? He should have been tossing the old jack-o'-lantern around a little bit first before anyone started to panic. It's also fair to say that, despite the lack of originality and special effects, it was still a reasonably creepy outfit that managed to frighten everyone away. a creepiness that managed to increase later after Elwood's head was stolen by the Headless Horseman and appeared as a ghastly white face with dark circles around the eyes, and for some reason, fangs. Do you suppose Tim Burton was inspired by the teeth on the Headless Horseman here when he made his own movie based on Sleepy Hollow? I'm giving the Headless Horseman an outfit score of 2.5 out of 5. Neutral because none of the positives, the appropriateness of the disguise and its scariness, are outweighed by the negatives, the lack of originality and special effects. Elwood's plan had 3 parts. The first was dressing up as a Headless Horseman to scare off the party guests. The second was to convince Gertrude to give him her necklace for safekeeping. And the third was to fake his own disappearance so he could leave the country with the stolen jewelry. All 3 elements were successfully implemented, just not that well. I have no complaints about the first 2 parts. Dressing up as a ghost is what makes a Scooby villain, and doing so definitely helped convince Elwood's aunt to give him her necklace, which he successfully absconded with. What's left was absolutely flawed, and all the clues the gang found signaled an extremely careless implementation of the scheme.
Maybe he did this time, but he left us a clue. Look, these wood chips.
First, the wood chips on the floor of the sewing room.
Because a tree down the road fell over and snapped the telephone lines as well as the power lines. Somebody chopped it down with an axe.
An axe? That might explain those wood chips we found.
As anyone who has ever cut down a living tree with an axe would attest, it's a messy job, and you would likely get quite a few wood chips splattered on your clothes. For Elwood to have carried that many into the house with him implies he was wearing either his business suit or the Headless Horseman outfit while swinging the axe. It would have been a lot smarter to have worn a different set of clothes while doing such messy prep work.
Zoinks!
What's happened?
Like maybe you didn't pay the electric bill.
I want a head!
Why did I use the word implies just now when questioning what he had been wearing? The Headless Horseman burst into the ballroom immediately after the power went out. Elwood should have been unable to chop down the tree to disable the power and make it back to the house that quickly anyway, let alone change outfits, proving he had to have been wearing his costume at the time he was using the axe. In addition to the Headless Horseman appearing way too soon after the power went out, the timing of events here is off as well.
I called the bank manager and he'll be waiting for me.
Drive carefully in this fog.
Oh, no!
It's him again!
As Elwood drives away in his car, we hear a horse, followed immediately by him riding that horse back toward the house wearing the Headless Horseman's clothes and his makeup. There is no way he would have had the time to change into his disguise in such a short span of time.
It was all my fault.
Jeepers! All that's left of him is a pile of clothes and a pumpkin head.
The Headless Horseman took Elwood to the grave with him.
Also, if he crashed his car into the tree, why didn't we hear that happen? Surely it would have been louder than a horse's whinny.
Don't call me Shirley.
In an episode featuring head swapping, perhaps it's appropriate that the animators would do the same with Scooby-Doo and Scooby-Dum. Speaking of head swapping, the crime scene was suspiciously tidy for one that purportedly involved a decapitation. The inside of that car should have looked like Kevin bringing in his famous chili.
No clues?
Then what's that stuck to the end of your nose? It's a tiny picture of Elwood with glue on the other side.
It's determined later that this photograph was from Elwood's passport, which he would have needed for international travel. The thing is, this should have been immediately identified as a lost passport photo because even back in the days when they were glued inside the book, as opposed to being printed directly on one of the pages, there would have been a stamp or other markings on it to prevent forgery. Also, who made the glue for the passport photo that it would fall out of the book so easily? The same people who made the glue on the back of my wall-mounted wire covers? They bragged on the package that the adhesive was 3M. They neglected to say the 3M stood for 3 minutes.
And here's something else strange. The ignition key is missing.
But what would a ghost want with a set of car keys?
In addition to the photo, the gang felt that the missing keys from Elwood's car was suspect because it implied he took them with him, which would not have been the expected actions of a kidnap victim.
A clue!
Hey! Scooby-Doo found a clue!
The final in what could be described as an avalanche of clues, Scooby-Dum digs up a buried newspaper clipping that provided the motive for Elwood's crime.
Apex International Shoe Manufacturers files for bankruptcy.
This one is baffling to me. For starters, why would Elwood have kept a newspaper clipping of his bankruptcy? Most people tend to keep such things to commemorate happy moments in their lives or major historical events. If you're someone too ashamed to ask a wealthy relative for financial help, but desperate enough to steal from them, you're probably the sort who wouldn't want to keep a humiliating memento of your public failure. Setting aside the unlikely existence of the newspaper clipping, why would Elwood have taken the moment of his kidnapping to bury it? Was he desperately searching for his passport photo in his car, found the newspaper clipping he had stupidly kept, and decided it was incriminating enough that it had to be disposed of right then and there? And again, when would he have had the time to do this when he shouldn't have even had the time to change into the Headless Horseman in the first place? Indeed, the entire head swap missing body aspect of Elwood's scheme was incredibly stupid, because no matter what happened after Gertrude's necklace was stolen, he was going to be the principal suspect. Instead of faking his abduction, Elwood should have just driven straight to the airport, hopped in the plane, and took off, because that would have given him the best chance for a clean getaway. It would likely have taken hours before anyone noticed that he had been gone from the house long enough to worry. With the power and phone lines cut, contacting the authorities would also be delayed, giving Elwood a very large head start before an investigation even began. Furthermore, while preparing for his flight, he might have noticed his passport was missing its photo and found it as well as the incriminating newspaper clipping, allowing him to fly away with both. Eventually, his car would be found at the airport, and as his bankruptcy was a matter of public record, the police would easily put two and two together. But he would already be in another country by then, ready to start living under whatever assumed name he chose for himself. Instead, Elwood the drama queen openly rode his horse back toward the house, where everyone saw his face clearly as he wore the Headless Horseman's clothes, removing any doubt that he was behind the scheme.
But we didn't figure that out until the butler mentioned that the phone line was down.
Which meant Elwood had to be lying when he told us that he had telephoned the bank manager.
From a mystery writing standpoint, this was clever, and I wonder how many people caught it. I would go so far as to say this was one of the best Scooby episodes from that perspective, because like an Encyclopedia Brown story, clues were hidden in the dialogue that would tip off the audience if they were paying attention. However, we're not rating how well the episode is written, but rather the quality of the villain. And the Headless Horseman was a bit of a disappointment. He gets a 1.5 out of 5 for the operation. Elwood did get his hands on the necklace, but just about everything else he did was just dumb.
Dum, 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 dum.
Pun 3/4 intended. Elwood Crane, the Headless Horseman, gets a final due score of 2 out of 5. Our first legitimately disappointing villain of the season.
Potato salad, fried chicken, corn on the cob, pumpkin pie, and for dessert, just a touch of pizza. Uh-oh!
Why would anyone invite Shaggy or Scooby to their party? Setting aside the catering expenses, they never leave any food for the other guests.
But wasn't there a second dog with you?
Sure, Scooby-Dum, Scooby-Doo's brother. Are you kidding? Scooby-Dum is Scooby's cousin.
Scooby-Dooby-Dum!
Scooby, that's not your cousin.
It's one thing for the gang not to have consistent family relationships from one incarnation to another, but they couldn't even keep Scooby's family relationship straight in the same series. Then again, technically, there is a way Scooby-Dum can be both Scooby-Doo's brother and cousin. It might even explain a few things about Dum.
Where is Scooby-Dum?
Here. You cool? Scooby-Dooby-Dum! Scooby-Dooby-Doo!
Typically, a costume like that is worn by two human beings, because it takes two bipedal creatures to make up a quadruped animal like a horse. However, Scooby-Doo and Scooby-Dum are both quadrupeds themselves. There's nothing wrong with what they did, but it just feels weird, like feeding bacon to a pig. Shaggy and Scooby are always eating food off the ground. At least Scooby is a dog. What's your excuse, Shaggy?
Wow, Scoob, you sounded like a real horse that time.
Thanks.
Generally speaking, the animation in the Scooby-Doo Show exhibited significant improvement over the new Scooby-Doo movies. Generally speaking.
Well, it looks like the party's over. Guess we'd better be going too, right?
Wrong. That Phantom isn't getting away with this.
As we learn later, the villain's goal was to steal Gertrude's diamond necklace, which, as we can clearly see here, she is not currently wearing. Did the Phantom already get away with it after all?
Look, it's Pumpkinhead!
Very few would store a bowling ball like that, without a bag and sitting on a shelf from where it could easily roll off and hit someone below. See what I mean? Shaggy could have been seriously injured. Or not.
No, Tarloff, I don't think so.
It's good to see that C.L. Magnus's butler found a new position after his boss was arrested for doing that whole pirate ghost thing.
Can you explain this, Tarloff?
You made a call, sir, that I served spice cake to the guests. In the excitement, I failed to clean the powdered sugar from my hand.
The butler served the cake hours ago. How in the hell would he not notice or clean that much powdered sugar off his hands? Every surface from the kitchen to the ballroom should be covered with powdered fingerprints. Though obviously trying to establish a red herring, this was an extremely contrived way for the Scooby writers to explain his white hands. Why not just have him wear white gloves?
This looks like one mystery that has us stumped.
I like to think Velma was making a grim joke here by saying stumped, considering they were chasing a headless ghost.
We're gonna have a little surprise waiting for our headless friend.
Like what?
We're going to use this parachute to drop in on him unexpectedly.
Where the hell did that parachute come from? It wasn't there in the previous shot. And even if it was, what kind of airport leaves parachutes lying around the floor? There is no way the airplane would fly level like that with all that weight on just the one wing. Yeah! Oh, but now it tips.
How did you know it was my cousin Elwood?
The missing car keys were the first tip-off.
The final wrap-up begins with Beth off-camera asking how the gang knew Elwood was the villain. However, she is never shown at any point throughout the end of the episode. For copyright match reasons, I can't show the entire scene here, so you'll have to trust me.
Trust me.
I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon members and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. Heckla Games. Thank you, Heckla Games. Mick. Thank you, Mick. Rob H. Thank you, Rob H. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal thank you in my next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a member. After attending a magic show, the gang visit the home of yet another wealthy relative, only to discover the old man is missing and his castle is being haunted by the spirit of a much more famous magician than the one they saw earlier that night. Stage magician Zarko, disguised as Merlin from the Arthurian legend, with the aid of an unnamed henchman, disguised as a Black Knight, abducts Shaggy's Uncle Shagworthy, imprisoning him in the dungeon of the old man's castle home so they can search the place for a stash of hidden jewels. When the gang arrive, the villain uses the tricks of his trade to try to frighten them away.
Illusion, Michael. Trick is something else.
Wait a minute. A crooked stage magician holed up in a castle uses his magic skills to scare away intruders while he searches for a hidden treasure. Why does that sound familiar? This entire Scooby-Doo episode borrows heavily from previous ones.
Uncle Shagworthy took a liking to an old castle in England, so he had it shipped over here and put it back together stone by stone.
I love how nonchalant the Scooby writers are about tossing this fact into their stories, when in real life, transporting castles overseas was extremely rare, involving a massive undertaking requiring stupid amounts of money. It also occasionally involved committing crimes, as some countries, concerned about preserving their cultural history, outlawed the practice. Of course, rich people with massive egos are seldom concerned about hurting the interests of society by engaging in ill-advised vanity projects that make things worse for everyone. In addition to the rehash of Bluestone the Great's plan from Hassel and the Castle, we see an old medieval European fortress brought over to America stone by stone, as seen in A Gaggle of Galloping Ghosts and The Haunted Horseman of Hagglethorne Hall. In the latter, it was also a rich uncle of one of the protagonists who brought the castle over. Speaking of which, this is the second time one of Shaggy's wealthy New England uncles appears, the first having been Nathaniel from the Loch Ness Mess. In addition to reusing the rough outline of Hassel and the Castle, just like how that episode provided Shaggy with a floating sandwich after he asked for one, this time it's a flagon of water.
No sooner said than done! Mike, thanks!
It's all right.
Both episodes also feature a normally inanimate object saying "Sawdite" to Shaggy, a helpful skull in the former, and the water flagon in the latter.
They went that away.
Oh, thanks, man.
It's all right.
Incidentally, "Sawdite" was a catchphrase used by famous ventriloquist Senior Wenthus, and frequently showed up in Hanna-Barbera cartoons at the time. This isn't exactly esoteric knowledge, but it's likely many modern viewers would not get the reference. Continuing on, this is the third time one of the villains was a knight, with one appearing in the very first Scooby episode, What a Night for a Night, and the aforementioned The Haunted Horseman of Hagglethorne Hall. And this is the second time it was specifically a black one. Again, the first being the one from What a Night for a Night.
Look deep and become my evil apprentices. Art thou now my slaves?
Yes, master!
Zarko uses his magic skills to hypnotize both Shaggy and Scooby, which also happened to them in Bedlam Under the Big Top. Though here, they're ordered to harm Fred, Daphne, and Velma, whereas the Ghost Clown ordered them to hurt themselves. Having, I think, firmly established that Zarko's plan failed completely at originality, this leaves us with how profitable it was and the likelihood of success.
I keep all my greatest treasures in the refrigerator. Like, wow! You must be holding a cool million in jewels there, Unc. Shall we say a very cool million, nephew?
I mentioned in my analysis of Elwood Crane's Headless Horseman scheme how tricky it would be trying to fence his Aunt Gertrude's diamond necklace, because it would be a lot easier to determine if gemstones already arranged as jewelry were stolen. If presented to them, most scrupulous buyers would balk, or at worst, call the authorities. Here, however, we clearly see Uncle Shagworthy's gemstones are pre-cut and unaffixed to anything. Being haphazardly kept in a bucket like that may also be an indication that the old man did a poor job of cataloging them, making it that much harder to file a police report should they be stolen. Also, keeping them in a bucket like that absolutely makes it a lot easier for a thief to carry them away. I would love to be able to put an actual dollar amount on what those gems were worth, but unlike gold, where the value can be relatively easily tracked over the decades, jewel prices are trickier because not only does the market fluctuate, there are certain cartels that handle the trade with the ability to manipulate prices. Also, while we could make an educated guess as to what the gems we see are, plenty of precious stones share the same colors, and we don't know for certain what's at the bottom of the bucket. At best, we can at least assume multiple millions of dollars, because, as mentioned before, you need an obscene amount of wealth to be able to afford the cost of shipping a castle overseas, so Uncle Shagworthy's fortune had to be immense. He's described as one of the world's biggest jewel dealers, so that bucket likely constitutes a significant amount of his fortune. Provided Zarko didn't try unloading them all at once, it shouldn't be that difficult for him to spend his remaining years selling a few at a time to bankroll a lavish retirement. I can't help but wonder, though, why Zarko resorted to crime in the first place. He's clearly a successful stage magician, as we see him performing in front of what appeared to be a full theater. It's the same thing I wondered with Pietro the Puppet Master. Obviously, just because you're wealthy doesn't mean you won't resort to some shady activities, but I do question the motivation of a few Scooby villains. Finally, had the gang not arrived, just how likely would it have been for Zarko to succeed? Well, there were two of them robbing an old man who lived alone in a huge castle equipped with a dungeon perfect for holding prisoners. The odds of getting away with it were extremely high. It also helps that Zarko and his henchmen had zero relationship to Uncle Shagworthy. It's a lot easier to steal from a random victim who would be unlikely to ever see you again. Zarko gets an operation score 4 out of 5. Despite how much of the plan came straight out of earlier Scooby episodes and the importance of being unique, the sheer amount of money at stake, as well as how easy it would be normally to get away with this crime, far outweigh the lack of originality. We've already established that the Black Knight is not unique in the Scooby-Doo-niverse, nor is it particularly frightening, as it offers the same amount of intimidation you'd get from a huge American football player heading toward you. Sure, you'd run away, but at no point would your underwear be in any danger. That leaves this section to focus solely on Zarko's Merlin disguise. There's no need to discuss his pointless Clarence mask, which I'll go over in the next part. Is the Merlin disguise unique? Well, we've had monsters who could use magic before, with the witch and a couple of witch doctors. We also had a ghost that could turn people old, and a mummy that could turn people to stone, both of which I'd argue count as magic. We've also had monsters based on folklore before, like the Yeti or Bigfoot. Though, yes, that latter wasn't technically a Sasquatch. So Merlin is not unique. Did he employ special effects? Yes, he did. Whenever Zarko used his magic wand, it sparkled, and his appearances were accompanied by appropriate smoke and sound effects. He also summoned ghosts to chase the gang, but I would classify those as technically props and not count them as part of the Merlin disguise. Was Merlin scary? Well, the gang felt so because they ran from him, but that's not saying a lot. If you were to bump into Zarko in his disguise at a Renaissance fair, you would either congratulate him for his attention to detail or complain to the organizers that fictional characters weren't allowed, depending upon the thickness of the stick in your butt. Many of the villains in the Scooby-Doo Show are fan favorites, and Merlin here is no exception. So it pains me to give him and the Black Knight a 1.5 out of 5 for their outfits. Neither was original nor particularly frightening, and the only thing going for them was Zarko's flashy wand and smoke bombs, the latter of which, to be blunt, has also been done before. After being rescued by the gang from his dungeon prison, Uncle Shagworthy recounts his troubles with Merlin and the Black Knight, stating they had been haunting the place for 2 weeks. 2 weeks.
2 weeks!
Why did Zarko spend that long looking for the jewels? He and his henchmen were ruthless, as shown by the events in the episode. For starters, they not only broke into Uncle Shagworthy's castle and his private study to abduct him, they locked him in a dungeon. And not comfortably either.
I don't like the looks of this place.
And I don't like the sounds of it either. We're in a dungeon.
Setting aside the villains, maintaining accuracy of a castle you brought over from England stone by stone is one thing, but why keep the dungeon as well? And we're not talking about the bare rooms, which could conceivably be used for storage or even a wine cellar. Shagworthy made sure to include the locks on the doors, the wall chains, and manacles. We're talking about a rich man living by himself with a fully functional dungeon in his basement. That's weird, right? 50 Shades of Grey? Delisle? Getting back to Zarko, this is horrific treatment of Uncle Shagworthy. It's one thing to imprison your kidnapped victim in a locked room, but he was chained to a wall, bound by all four limbs, his waist and neck, in a standing cross position. We don't know how long he was left like that, but this would quickly become painful enough to be considered torture, especially for a man of his age. And that's not taking into consideration bodily functions that would normally be reserved for a toilet.
Here to join us, Mr. Shagworthy?
I can't. I've got an allergy.
Allergy?
I'm allergic to ghosts.
Like I said, like uncle, like nephew.
They're just cheerfully hanging around in a dungeon. I don't know about you, but I would not want to remain inside an easily locked room in a castle where nobody knows I'm at with two intruders wandering around. All Merlin or the Black Knight would need to do is shut the door and bolt it, and after a few weeks, problem solved.
Look deep and become my evil apprentices. Art thou now my slaves?
Yes, master.
My former friends are in the library. You shall dispose of them.
In addition to their willingness to torture a helpless victim, Zarko and his henchmen indirectly try to murder Fred, Daphne, and Velma by hypnotizing Shaggy and Scooby to kill them.
Pull the Falcon's secret feather lever that will dispose of them forever. It will drop them in the moat where they'll float like a bottomless boat. You say it.
Okay. Falcon's feather thing to drop them in the rope they'll float like a rattling now.
Ah, excellent!
I'm certain the writers had no intention to do this, but this bit here is a clue to Merlin's real identity of Zarko. As we saw, he hypnotized Scooby and demanded that he repeat the instructions he was just given. Merlin demanded that a dog repeat the instructions he was just given.
I shall attempt to saw through the box and my volunteer.
Saw through us?
Oh no, we change our minds, Zarko.
It would be crazy for any normal person to expect a canine to be able to speak a human tongue. However, earlier in the evening, we saw Scooby speaking in front of Zarko, thus cluing in the magician that Scooby was capable of speech. Granted, that should have blown Zarko's mind, as well as everyone else's in the audience, but we'll ignore that. Up to that point, only those on the stage or in the audience that night would have known ahead of time of Scooby's ability to speak. And as most episodes in the Scooby-Dooverse play by TV detective rules, whereby the bad guy is almost always a character introduced to the audience earlier in the show, this leaves Zarko as the only real option to be the one wearing the Merlin disguise.
Whoa! Watch it, Shag. You almost dropped down into the moat. Now!
Okay.
They tried to trap us in that chandelier.
Trap you in that chandelier? This was amazingly generous of Velma. Look at the state of it. It's completely demolished and would have caused serious or even fatal injuries to anyone standing underneath it when it fell. For being a smug know-it-all, she's rather clueless when it comes to recognizing attempted murder. This entire hypnosis sequence deserves a bit of scrutiny. In real life, hypnotism is generally bullshit. While it does exist as a lesser-used option in mental health treatment, what's typically shown in film and television is not real. Setting that aside, most pop culture depictions of hypnosis agree that even if it did work, typically the person entranced would not do anything that is fundamentally against their own personal code of conduct. For example, if you hypnotized someone to think they were naked, they would act embarrassed and try to cover up the more fun parts of their body. But if you asked that same person to drown a kitten, they wouldn't, because that's not something they would do when fully awake. Well, most people wouldn't. It's interesting that here, both Shaggy and Scooby seem more than willing to kill Fred, Daphne, and Velma. Technically speaking, when Scooby triggered the trapdoor, he knew from Merlin's instructions that it was meant to drown the rest of the gang. And what did Shaggy think would happen if that chandelier was dropped on his friends? One could argue that at the last minute they changed their minds, which is why they held onto the cord after untying it. At least, I'd like to think that despite years of abuse from Fred, Daphne, and Velma, it never got so bad that Shaggy and Scooby would want to see them dead. We've established that Zarko and his apprentice were ruthless enough to resort to kidnapping, torture, and murder, so why did they spend 2 fruitless weeks looking for Shagworthy's jewels? The fact they were able to abduct him so easily means they could have done that at any time. Did they finally get frustrated enough to kidnap Shagworthy to starve and torture the location of the jewels out of him? It was Zarko and his henchmen's mistake to wait so long to do that, and for them to spring their trap the night of the gang's visit. Getting back to Uncle Shagworthy for a moment, in the 2 weeks Merlin and the Black Knight were terrorizing him, why didn't he contact the authorities? Was he afraid they wouldn't believe him and commit him to a mental institution for his own safety? Or was there perhaps a more sinister reason Shagworthy didn't want the police on the scene? Were his gems legitimately sourced? Or were they obtained through less than savory means? De Beers isn't above trading blood diamonds, so who knows what kindly Uncle Shagworthy might be capable of when no one is around. Is paranoia over being caught the reason he doesn't hire servants or security? Don't forget, the dude had a fully equipped dungeon under his home.
Like who needs magic? I always keep a few snacks around for emergencies.
Who prepared all this food? There's no way a single person could maintain a castle household, let alone prepare a mountain of food like that in such a short amount of time. Even if we accept it was Shagworthy who did so, he was locked in a dungeon for hours. How long was that food sitting out? That's fish. Do you know how bad it would smell by now? Setting aside Shagworthy's potential motives for doing so, it is completely ridiculous that the writers would have an extremely wealthy man be as alone as he was. With that much money and with a house that large, it's simply unreasonable to accept that he wouldn't have had security or cleaning staff. Even Howard Hughes, a multimillionaire famous for being an insane recluse, usually had at least a dozen aides around.
What a creepy place. Your uncle even brought over the spider webs.
No, this is what happens if you buy a massive house, but don't hire anyone to maintain it. You'll notice I'm not mentioning how dumb it was for the villains to resort to kidnapping. That's because this is one of the few times when they would ordinarily be expected to get away with it. Abducting someone that nobody would notice was missing is about as close to the perfect kidnapping as you can get. It's such a good idea, a Bond villain once used it as part of their scheme.
No sooner said than done. Mike, thanks.
It's all right.
I brought up this same point when discussing Bluestone the Great's floating sandwich and mustard jar. How did Zarko know ahead of time to set up that floating water flagon for Shaggy? In addition to the questionably convenient water flagon, Zarko and his henchmen successfully rigged the castle with all those ghost effects, including a trick organ that would control the specters, as well as all the necessary cameras and wiring needed for the closed-circuit TV system. Of course, it was also possible they merely tapped into an existing system of cameras and wiring Shagworthy had installed throughout his castle for whatever reason. Possibly even less than savory ones. Don't forget, the dude had a fully equipped dungeon under his home. It must be said that some of the clues found by the gang should not have been considered clues found by the gang.
And look, I think I found a clue. A red scarf.
I wonder what it means.
What? It's just a scarf. Why would that look so suspicious to Velma? Fred wondered what it meant. It meant Shaggy's uncle probably got cold in his huge, poorly insulated castle that probably didn't have central heating.
Then about 2 weeks ago, promptly at 12:15 every night, the darn Merlin ghost and his tin can pal started prowling around the castle.
I have a hunch that's another clue to our mystery. But the most important clue was when you told us that Merlin's ghost always appeared at 15 minutes after midnight.
Zarko's magic show in town is over at midnight, and it took him 15 minutes to get here.
A clockwork haunting 15 minutes after midnight is hardly a clue that would have narrowed down the potential suspects to Zarko. The only reason he's even a suspect is for the arbitrary reason that the gang had attended his show earlier. Otherwise, he had zero connection to Shagworthy. Before concluding, there is one last thing to discuss. What was the point of the Clarence disguise?
Who are you?
A
Clarence, the caretaker. Now please, leave here.
Where's Mr. Shagworthy?
The master disappeared.
Away with him!
No! No! No, no, no!
This episode only has 2 villains, but there are 3 people in this scene, with Zarko technically being 2 of them. I'm willing to accept that this is the magician in his Clarence disguise and his henchman as the Black Knight, while the Merlin shown here is just a projection. But as I'll go over shortly, this is never actually explained. The audience is expected to come up with their own explanation. That's sloppy writing. The fact that at no point did Shagworthy mention his caretaker, or that there were never any scenes with the rich man interacting with an employee, leads me to believe that Clarence was created by Zarko on the fly after they abducted Shagworthy to handle any possible visitors while they continued their search for the hidden jewels.
This must be the treasury room, but it's been ransacked.
How did Fred know the room was ransacked before opening the door? From a narrative standpoint, you would want to see the victim having scenes with his caretaker so that it's a big reveal at the end when the caretaker disguise is revealed. That doesn't happen here. Furthermore, if Zarko dressed as Clarence to turn away visitors, why did he do it the way he did? Instead of telling the gang that Shagworthy was missing, then staging his own fake kidnapping, why didn't Clarence just tell them that Shagworthy wasn't home, or that he couldn't be disturbed and said to refuse any visitors? Hell, this was well after midnight, so he could have just said Shagworthy was asleep and the kids should come back in the morning. That would have given Zarko and his henchmen hours to persuade Shagworthy to cough up his gemstones. Instead, by having the Black Knight appear to take Clarence away, thus showing what might have happened to Shagworthy, this only increased the gang's motivation to stay and investigate. Kidnapping is like waving a red scarf in front of a bull in terms of motivating these teenagers to meddle.
We're going into that castle and rescue your uncle.
I know I said it in a previous video when discussing the opening titles, but where are your arms, Shaggy?
Now I have the... Ah! It's empty! We must find them!
Merlin looked straight down the neck hole. How did he not see Shaggy and Scooby hiding in there?
Now all we have to do to wrap it up is trap Merlin and his tin-suited buddy.
But a trap needs bait.
We're all set with the trap. Now let's see what's happening.
It looks like Merlin and the Black Knight have taken the bait.
Right into the ballroom. Now!
One magic spell coming up.
Abracadabra!
Pull them down and it will all be over!
Yes, master.
Watch it, you dolt!
Finally, we come to how Merlin and the Black Knight were caught. For starters, the gang really didn't have a plan for catching them. They make Shaggy and Scooby act as live bait as usual, and there was mention that it was important to get the villains in the ballroom where Daphne could use Zarko's organ against them, but that's it. There were no nets, no trapdoors, no ropes, no chains. There was nothing set up in the trap that would, actually trap the bad guys.
Aha! So that's their hiding place.
Scooby's tail was coming out of the top of the brazier, but he was on the bottom under Shaggy. Just how long is his tail?
That's your cue, Daph.
Right. Oh no! My finger's stuck in the keys.
This has always bugged me every time I see this episode. How in the hell do you get your finger caught between the keys of an organ? I know Daphne's the cute skinny one, but just how thin are her fingers supposed to be?
I can't work the trick.
Danger-prone Daphne did it again.
If looks could kill. Between Fred and Velma always forcing Shaggy and Scooby to be live bait, and all the times they make fun of Daphne for being clumsy, it's no wonder those 3 went off on their own in a later series. Fortunately for the good guys, Zarko and his henchmen pursue Shaggy and Scooby until they literally catch themselves in a manner so stupid they put Carl the Stuntman to shame. F***ing Carl the Stuntman.
Well, the first clue was when the Black Knight disappeared through the wall with Clarence.
That's an old magician's trick. The electric console that made all the ghosts of the Round Table appear was just a magician's type of illusion.
Velma isn't explaining anything here. In other episodes, they took pains to show film projectors or mirrors to explain the ghost effects. But now they hand-wave it as just something professional magicians can do. Then again, perhaps Velma was just respecting the old magic code of never revealing how a trick is done.
Illusion, Michael. Trick is something else.
When it comes to their operation score, again, this is painful, but I'm giving them a low 2 out of 5. Zarko and his henchmen were willing to kill and torture, but they wasted so much time getting to that point. They never found what they were looking for, and the way they trapped themselves at the end was just humiliating. Zarko and the Black Knight get a final due score of 2.5 out of 5. And that's my ranking of the villains from the third set of episodes of the first season of the Scooby-Doo Show, shown here along with the ones from my previous videos. All the villains featured this time were surprisingly disappointing, but the episodes themselves were still entertaining. Remember, I'm rating the villains based on, admittedly, an arbitrary scoring system, but not the show itself, which is still, hands down, so much better than the previous series. Hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. If you watched this far for a final quip, sorry?